Okay, so moving on to our first build step, and immediately I'm going to deviate from the manual and not build the rotor head first. And the reason I do this is if you build the frames first, the frames are a fairly sturdy design. You can put them to one side on their skids and then build the rotor head and then fit the rotor head to the frames. If you build the rotor head first, it's a fairly unwieldy bit of equipment once it's built, and it tends to get left lying around, and then more often than not it will get trod on or damaged in some way before you fitted it to your frames. So I always like to build the frames first, as it gives me a nice sturdy frame set, and once I've built the rotor head I can immediately fit it into the frames and keep it out of harm's way. So the parts we're going to be doing for this build step, obviously the frames themselves and the second carbon frame here. We've got the plastic parts for fitting to the frames, the front battery tray, the tail servo and the anti-rotation slider. And then some more parts here, the motor mount. And in this bag here we've got our bearing blocks, various frame fitting components, screws, nuts and bolts, and a little carbon tray which I think is for the gyro. Mounts up the mounts on the frame somewhere, we'll find out where. So those are the parts we're going to be using, and of course the last thing that we fitted to the frames is the undercarriage, which is still in the packet. So I'll get the first bits of these ready and we can get on with the build. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the various metal pieces of hardware, bolt them into both of our side frames effectively, so that we're in a position to then bolt the two side frames together. These little mounting parts here go into these recesses along the bottom of the frame here. Obviously the motor mount goes up the front here somewhere, and then there's this little frame brace which sits right up the top here between the two frames. So I'm going to mount these various parts into the bottom here and show you where each one of these go, because each one is different. So I'll just show you how that goes. Okay, so there we have the three parts mounted into the bottom of our frame. Now if I just turn this up like this, you can see that the smaller of the two goes right at the front of the frames where the battery, smaller of the three goes at the front where the battery tray is. Then the one with three holes in it goes in the middle, and then the largest one goes at the back, and this is actually providing a mounting point for our tail boom supports. And it's just three collared screws go through each, and these are shaped, these parts, so they can only fit one way into the frame. So you can see that they're bolted on like so, and they are shaped, they have a rounded shape to them to fit into the recess in the frames. Okay, so let's move on and put the motor mount in, and also start looking at the bearing blocks as well. Okay, so there's our motor mount installed into the frames. Make note of which way up this has gone in. The flat sort of non-heat sink side is towards the top of the frames, and then the sort of ribbed side is towards the bottom of the frames. And you mount the motor mount towards you've mounted these pieces at the bottom first, and you can see they're sort of sticking inwards, and that's the side you put the motor mount. You don't put the motor mount this other side where your screws are on the outside of the frame. So motor mount to the inside, like so. Next thing to go on is our frame brace, and this goes right at the top of the frames up here. So I'm going to put that on, and then we're going to put the bearing blocks in. Okay, so there we have that frame brace installed at the top, just here. And now we can put the bearing blocks in. Okay, so here we have our bearing blocks. Now it's important that you get these in the right way round. Now if you look at the bearing blocks, basically you'll see that there is one side of the bearing block where the bearing is completely open and would drop into the bearing block, and then there is another side that is closed off, which is the opposite side to the open end. So if I switch this one over, you can see that's the open-ended part of the bearing block where you would push the bearing in, and then that's the closed off side where you can't really get the bearing out of. Now, the way the bearing blocks go together is the upper bearing block goes in the top of the frames with the bearing facing towards the sky, and the lower bearing block goes in the bottom of the frames with the open-ended part of the bearing towards the ground. So effectively you've got the closed off parts of the blocks facing each other, and the open-ended part of the blocks facing towards the sky and towards the ground. So I'll put those in and show you that in the frames as well. Okay, so here we have our bearing blocks installed. You can see the open-ended part of the bearing is towards the top, and then if I turn the frames upside down, you can see the open-ended part of the bearing towards the bottom, and then both of the closed off parts of the bearing are in this middle bit between the two blocks. At this point you don't want to Loctite these blocks in, just put the screws in, undo them up, you know, hand tight but not overly tight, because we want to make sure that our bearing blocks are seated properly in the frames, and in order to do that we need to put the main shaft through once the frames are all built and then tighten up the blocks. So for the moment just install these lightly. Okay, so the next thing I've done is I've inserted this gyro platform at the back of the frames, and it just pokes through some holes that are in the frames, as you can see here, and that's that in place, and then it will go through similar holes in the other side frame, the other side, and also on the other side frame I've added the little bits to the bottom of the frame, as you can see there, for when these will bolt together. The next step is to put the bottom tray, which I have here, onto the side frames. This little bit with a cutout here goes towards the front of the frames and the motor mount, and it basically goes on the bottom like that. You can only secure it at the middle point because the skids actually secure it at the front and the rear. So I'm just going to put the screws in to secure it on this middle point here, and then once this bottom frame is on, we're in a position to bolt the other frame to this frame and tighten it all up. Okay, so there we have our bottom tray mounted, and it's a button head screw you use to mount this in here, not the cap headed screws that we've been using on the rest of the items on the frame. So button head screw. Make sure the other holes line up as well, for that's because you've got two screw holes you can use here, and you can see I've used the rear one here to allow the holes to line up for the undercarriage mounting. So the next thing to do is to bolt the two frames together. Okay, and here we have the completed frame set, all bolted together. See our gyro platform at the back here in the two recesses. Bearing blocks all done up lightly, no Loctite on those yet. Every other screw has been bolted in and Loctited, and we've just got the two button screws in the bottom there holding this bottom plate on. And the next job is for us to fit the undercarriage to this frame set, which will secure that bottom plate and through the undercarriage screws hold that together, and then that's our frames completed, ready for servo installation. So first things first, let's get the undercarriage onto here. Okay, so here we have our undercarriage. I'm not going to insult you guys' intelligence by showing you how to build an undercarriage. I'm just going to point out a couple of things. Obviously struts, skid pipe stoppers, which we will use some cyano to glue in the ends, and these are the little rubbers that stop it skidding around on concrete, and I mount these on the insides of the skids, which I'll show you, rather than the outside, so you don't lose them. And then the bolts to bolt them onto the undercarriage, and then there's these little grub screws, and they go through these little holes here and bite into the skid pipe to stop it moving around once you put it onto the machine. So that's pretty much it. I'm just going to build it up and show you it built. Okay, so we can see here the built-up undercarriage. One thing to note is that the skids sort of angle forwards when you put them onto the skid pipe. As you can see, I've mounted the rubbers on the inside of the struts, and that's so that they can't come off. So you know they're retained on the skid pipe. If you put them this side, then typically they get lost and come off and disappear. Got the grub screws in the little hole here, ready to tighten down onto the skid pipes once I've aligned the skids properly. And all that's left is the screws for mounting up. Obviously the end plugs, I've cyanoed those in and they're now secure. It's really just a case now of lining this up against our frames to make sure that the holes here on the struts line up with the holes on the bottom of the frame. Bolt this on, and then we can start fiddling around with the skid pipes and get it all lined up so it looks nice and all the rest of it. But the key thing first is to get this bolted onto the frames so that we get these struts the correct distance apart before we tighten down these grub screws and align the skid pipes and all the rest of it. Okay, so we can see the struts now bolted onto the frames here and here, so the frames can now stand up. And now we want to align the skid pipe, you know, get it straight and move it backwards and forwards, you know, so that we've got, you know, equal amounts poking out front and rear, so that, you know, it all looks aesthetically correct. And then we can do up these grub screws so that they bite onto the skid pipes and pull the rubbers to the outsides and that kind of stuff, and just make it look pretty.